Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this webinar. I will be discussing a kidnap and ransom in Mexico, basically the avoidance, crisis management, and response to such event. My name is Art Garfer, and I am the Director of Operations for Latin America for AFI-MAC Global. Basically, this is a quick introduction to what we will be discussing. In order to first get to Mexico and what the trends are there that we're noticing right now, we first have to talk about basically what is the background to kidnapping. Why do people resort to kidnapping? What are the conditions for this? How do kidnappers measure their success? And then we can roll into basically the kidnapping tendencies in Mexico. I will ask that the questions, you please pose them into the questions box, and at the end of the presentation I will go ahead and answer those one by one. Basically, this is just a quick rundown of who I am, what my experience is on the matter. Besides being a Special Forces officer and currently in the National Guard as a Special Forces officer, I've worked in probably some of the most austere areas of the world in the corporate sector also. I was the security director for Vale do Rio Doce, the Brazilian mining giant. In South Africa, I was responsible for Africa, and then later on Africa and Latin America. And that was prior to coming to AFI-MAC Global, where now I'm the Director of Operations for Latin America, where I also spend a lot of time in some very high-risk and medium-risk countries, advising, assisting clients in the region. So let's talk a little bit in the background about kidnapping. Kidnapping is not something that just is new, is started recently as a result of the news outlets or any of the many security companies or consulting companies that exist. Kidnapping has been around for centuries, and it has been utilized for many different reasons. It did evolve out of the most salacious and evil quarters of human history. It is still currently a very common method of procuring slaves, and it's also been employed by outlaws and revolutionaries basically to seek intelligence, funding for their operations, and basically to try and have a heads up on anything that somebody else may be trying in their areas of operation. In specific parts of the world, as the states here in the last bullet, the benefits do outweigh the risks. In some countries of the world, there is no rule of law, there's weak judicial systems, and the penalty for such may not be applicable to the person committing the crime. So this is basically where the essence of kidnapping comes from. And you can definitely see that when there's an economic need or a financial need and there is no rule of law governing those acts, you can expect kidnapping to take on a totally different level of participation. Since 2009, we've seen ransom payments go up significantly. Right now, it's estimated to be somewhere between a $1 and $2 billion industry, for lack of a better word. Personnel do prefer to pay when there are kidnapping victims. However, this does have a secondary effect, basically that of providing a pathway for further kidnappings. In other words, a tacit okay to go ahead and continue to kidnap as a source of economic gain to others. Most of the kidnappers or syndicate leaders are never prosecuted, and by syndicate I use the term that's used in Latin America, which is sindicato, which is basically all of the unions that exist in Latin America. Back in the late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, they did resort a lot to kidnapping. However, that has diminished, but it is still a practice that they do participate in. It does replace people's livelihood. If we take the case of the pirates off Somalia, basically their argument for wanting to take tankers and other ships hostage and thus kidnap the people, was because they blamed these ships that would cross in their waters for the diminished amounts of fish that they could actually go and fish and sell in the market. They never saw that they had been doing overfishing for many years. So they basically saw this as an alternate source to replace their livelihood. And then we see some of the top 7 countries where kidnappings for ransom take place. Mexico is the number 1 currently in the world, and we'll go over some of the stats later on. And then we do see other indicators in India, Nigeria, Brazil, and very interesting enough, right now, Venezuela is actually number 2 in the world, a strong second to Mexico, due to the economic and financial factors that Venezuela currently finds itself in. The Philippines, we are noticing that the new president is trying to take some very strict and stern and very unorthodox actions, not only against the narco traffickers in the Philippines, but as a secondary and tertiary effect, also against those that do pose a threat in the area of kidnapping. So he is trying to take matters into his hands. However, he is receiving a lot of condemnation internationally just because of his tactics and procedures on such. Here's just to give you a bigger idea when we talk about the world's top 10 and where they rank. As you can see, Mexico, we're talking about 5,000 to 7,000, followed by Venezuela, once again, due to the financial crisis. Brazil is also high up there. That's mostly as a result of financial needs and wants. Nigeria is partially financial, but mostly related to Boko Haram and some of the other organizations in the area. And then we continue to go down. We see Haiti, Colombia. Colombia will be an interesting case here as we move forward with the peace accords. The first thing is, in the case of Colombia, the people are, the voters and the people of Colombia are supposed to go to a referendum to either accept or deny the terms of the peace accord. In addition to that peace accord, there are 4 parts that have yet to be agreed upon with the FARC, and the people are expected to vote on not knowing what the solution is to these 4 parts. So this is going to bring up some very interesting dynamics as you start to try to demobilize close to 10,000 guerrilla fighters who have known nothing other than war, conflict, kidnapping, narco trafficking, and et cetera, et cetera. So this will be a very interesting dynamic. We did discuss the Philippines very, very briefly, and that's something that the president of the Philippines is trying to curtail right now. When we talk about kidnapping and piracy, we can talk about, in the essence of piracy, we see the Caribbean Sea as a hotbed for piracy. We see the Gulf of Guinea, which is now the number 1 piracy location in the world. It used to be off the coast of Somalia, but now it has shifted into the Gulf of Guinea on the western side of Africa. There's still hostage taking and piracy in the waters of Somalia and the Indian Ocean, and then also in the Straits of Malacca. Now, when we talk about piracy and kidnapping, and we put it in the context of this map, what we should highlight is the fact that we're talking about corridors, and these are corridors where we have drug trafficking moving through. These are corridors where we have human trafficking, and these are corridors where we have weapons trafficking. Now, in each one of these corridors, in addition to them just being corridors, there's also sanctuaries in these locations, which facilitate the continued activity surrounding kidnapping. If you look at the Sahel region in Africa, it's heavily dominated by kidnapping, human trafficking, weapons trafficking, and the disappearance of peoples. If you look at Mexico down to Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela, we can look there at mostly narco trafficking, human trafficking, and weapons trafficking. So there's always either a combination of those 3 or a single one of those that does promote the act of kidnapping in those areas. So why do kidnappers resort to kidnapping? Some is for political views. We saw that with the IRA in Northern Ireland. We've seen it with the FARC and the ELN in Colombia. A lot of it is religious fanaticism. We've seen this in the news most recently with ISIS, and we've seen it from the 80s until now with Hezbollah, for example, in Lebanon and other parts of the world. We also see monetary gain, and that's coming mostly from cartels, narco cartels, human trafficking organizations. And we also see people who do kidnap for leverage on other folks. We've seen corporations in specific parts of the world kidnap another corporation's person in order to get some leverage. However, obviously that was a decentralized operation or a series of operations that were obviously not supported by the multinationals in play, mostly at the local level. We do see people trying to leverage corporate strategy, and we also see environmentalists who do take people hostage and do kidnap. So what are some of the conditions that allow for the thriving of kidnappers? Well, for one, and I mentioned it earlier, is there is no rule of law. Basically, you can get away with it. You can execute it, you can get paid, you can release a person or persons, or you can kill them. So if we look at the case of Nigeria, there's definitely no rule of law, and it has allowed for numerous amounts of kidnappings to take place. If you look at Libya, we can see the same activities. In certain parts of Mexico, the kidnappings, and we'll go into that later on, are at a very high level because most of these kidnappings are taking place in failed states. There's weak to non-judicial systems. In other words, if somebody does commit a kidnapping and is arrested, there is no judicial system that will do anything about it. In some countries, there's no laws that do govern, that just don't govern kidnapping. It's seen as a daily occurrence, and there's no laws against it. At times, there are punishments, but they don't equal the crime. So you can kidnap somebody, but you'll be in jail a week to 10 days, and you're back out. Now, in many countries of the world, you don't have the police forces that we see in the U.S., the UK, Canada, and some other countries like South Korea, and then Australia and other parts of Europe, for example. Their police forces are very much underpaid, they are overworked, and they're very much undertrained. So these police really don't want to go the extra mile, or sometimes they don't even want to do their own police enforcement job. So that does create a gap or a void for kidnappers to operate in. Corruption. We have noticed many levels of syndication whereby they have peeled back an organization who has dedicated itself to kidnapping, and they have seen levels of corruption very high in municipal, town, and state governments. So basically, they are being allowed to operate with any type of, they're being allowed to operate with impunity. There's no problem whatsoever because they're covered higher levels, and it is a source of income to those that are involved. And the reach of the authority is very weak. In other words, a lot of people are not reporting that their loved ones have been kidnapped, believe it or not, because the authority is weak and the authority cannot support them, and they prefer to be able and handle the matter at the lowest level possible. Some of the measures of success that kidnappers will utilize to justify continuing kidnapping as a source of income or a political, religious tool is insurance premiums are basically up tenfold. And it does create the conditions for further kidnappings. In the years discussed from 2009 to now, ransom amounts paid have increased over 300%. So a lot of pressure is also placed on the insurance companies when it comes to these increased amounts being paid. Maybe some of you here listening to this webinar or participating have noticed that maybe their premiums have gone up when it comes to the clauses governing kidnapping for any of your expats or any of your employees or any of your what's called in the insurance industry the financial lines sector. Technology. Kidnappers like to measure how much technology they needed to invest in order to get a return on their investment. In other words, were they able to do this just with a cell phone? Were they able to just do it with a beat-up vehicle, or did they have to take it further and incorporate technology, advanced vehicles, neutralizing personnel, et cetera, et cetera? So they will evaluate that, and if the lower the amount of investment they have to do to get a return, that to them is a success. In many countries, news outlets are concerned, are very controlled, and thus you will never hear of kidnappings taking place. And I'll defer to my previous comment where I stated that in many countries, people will prefer to deal with a kidnapping situation at the lowest level and not elevate it to a level where the press, for example, can catch wind of it, or in some other countries where it is known to everybody that somebody has been kidnapped, these news outlets will be controlled, and there will be basically a gag order on them to not report on any of the kidnappings. We also notice in many countries, Mexico being one of those, where statistics are manipulated. In other words, the government will say that there are no kidnappings in X, Y, or Z region in order to favor an impeding financial or economic agreement with a multinational to come in and set up one of their maquiladoras or factories in that area. The same was seen in Colombia with a lot of the oil companies when they first came in. So the statistics will be manipulated. However, there are NGOs that do track as closely as possible to the real number governing those that have been kidnapped. We have seen in some countries where there's been a bastardization of security forces, and what I mean by this is in order to respond to, let's say, a high incidence of kidnapping in a country, what they will do is they'll take people, resources, and budget from 20 different agencies to try and create this new agency. The problem is that the 20 agencies that they were taking from were already under-resourced, underfunded, and undertrained. So it's basically a knee-jerk reaction to try and show that something is being done. However, these folks are not properly trained to the level of, let's say, the Gaula in Colombia, which is exceptional at recovering kidnapped personnel. I mentioned again the syndicates. The syndicates do operate in the same circles as a lot of criminals in certain parts of Latin America and Africa and other regions. So they are very, very much aware of incidents that may take place prior to execution. And finally, what are some of the spin-off events that do happen when somebody is kidnapped? And these are things that the kidnapper will assess. So for example, if we do a electronic kidnapping whereby I go ahead and I call somebody's wife while blocking the husband's phone, I could probably get a 2-for-1. In other words, while I'm blocking the husband, the wife will show up with money to pay for her husband's release, and little does she know her husband's at the office working no problem, and we kidnap her, and now we engage the husband for another amount of money. So these are some of the spin-off events that they look at. What can they derive and what can they do from a kidnapping that's either ongoing or planned for a new one that may come down the road as they go through their planning cycle. Now when we talk about kidnapping tendencies in Mexico, obviously the region that is most affected by kidnappings in Mexico is the Northeast. That's the states basically of Coahuila, Durango, Tamaulipas, Nuevo León. When we talk about Tamaulipas, for example, that is a failed state. And a lot of these regions in gray in the Northeast are currently going through struggles between cartels. We have Jalisco Nueva Generación, which is basically based out of Jalisco, which is the only cartel that's created an open corridor between the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. And doing that, they have basically burrowed their way through two of the most prominent cartels in the Gulf area. One is the Gulf Cartel, and the second one is the Zetas. So when we talk about San Luis Potosí, we talk about Tamaulipas, which borders the U.S., along with Nuevo León and Coahuila. These are some states that have seen increased numbers of kidnappings taking place. When we talk about the southeast of the country, which is basically your regions of Veracruz, you're talking about Quintana Roo, Campeche, Chiapas. These are also areas that are heavily trafficked with narco terrorists or narcotics. In addition to this, though, in that region of, let's say, Veracruz, Tabasco, Campeche, and the Yucatan, there is a heavy presence of oil refineries and all those supporting elements that go to the offshore oil platforms. With the new Pemex, restructuring, we have seen a lot of U.S. companies coming into the region. Now they've held off a bit pending the November elections, but this will create another series of issues because now we're going to go onto onshore oil drilling and setting up in those regions. As Mexico's economy continues to dip significantly in the next 6 months, the power to purchase and the power to acquire goods and services by the Mexican people will become more difficult. This in and of itself will cause potentially kidnappings to go up in that region, Veracruz specifically. Currently under President Peña Nieto, the president has done a favorable job in placing a gag on the press and not allowing them to properly identify or report on the number of kidnappings in Mexico. We do notice, as I mentioned earlier, that there's 143, for example, kidnappings that have taken place in Tamaulipas so far. And then we look at some of the states. Michoacan, there was a big situation there between cartels engaging one another. One was a Knights Templar, which started out as a civic action against cartels, and eventually their intent was to push out cartels, but they themselves became one. The Estado de Mexico, which is one of the most violent, if not the most violent area in the immediate vicinity of Mexico City. And then we have Morelos and also Guerrero. The state of Guerrero, to remind you all, is where the 43 students disappeared late last year, who were kidnapped basically by a drug cartel under the orders of the mayor of one of the nearby cities of Iguala. In addition to that, the governor of the state was also implicated in this activity. And so what goes back to that piece where I mentioned corruption earlier. Corruption is rampant, and at some times political leaders will ask for the kidnapping of people if it's something that will benefit their cause. Some of the states with the highest incidence of kidnapping. This is basically December 2012 to current to the month of June. But you'll notice that the state of Mexico, right outside Mexico City, has the highest indicators of kidnapping. And one of the problems there is a lot of the lands in the state of Mexico are actually illegal lands where people live on. And the state has allowed people to, and by the state in this essence, I mean Mexico as a whole, has allowed the people in that region to build and continue to work in construction of these illegal housing areas. Now, anybody that travels outside of Mexico City through the state of Mexico is exposed to the poverty, and with the poverty comes the crimes associated with that as you drive through. And this is why the high risk of kidnappings in the state of Mexico. And then once again, we revisit the failed state of Tamaulipas, where even though there's a high federal police presence currently and also Mexican military presence, they have been unable to curtail not only the violence, but also the kidnappings that are taking place in Tamaulipas. Just to remind you, Reynosa is a big city in Tamaulipas where there are a lot of multinational factories in that area. And a lot of folks do commute to work from the U.S. across the border to Reynosa and then head back at the end of the day to the U.S. From December 2012 to this year, June, there's been a total of 7,846 kidnappings in Mexico. Now, when we're talking about these kidnappings also, we're not addressing those people that have been kidnapped and disappeared. And by this we mean illegal immigrants that have come from Central America into Mexico, and as they continue to cross through Mexico, cartels, police forces basically interdict them, and they end up being a statistic of disappeared. So these numbers are just cases that NGOs have come across that can be accounted for. So we're talking about roughly 182 kidnappings a month, which roughly is boiled down to 43 a week and 6 a day, and that's for the total in Mexico. These tendencies have not gone down. They have not shown any indicators that they are going down. And as I mentioned earlier, the fact that Mexico is in a deep or is moving into a deep economic, financial, and monetary debacle here within 6 to 7 months will only cause these numbers to jump up. I will say, though, that currently in Mexico, kidnapping Americans, Canadians, and certain foreigners is seen a lot as a headache to the kidnapping organizations, just because of the level of scrutiny that will come down from them, be it from the FBI and other organizations. However, most of the folks that do get kidnapped in Mexico tend to be middle class to low class Mexican folks. And a lot of these folks are employed by a lot of multinationals. So we have dealt with cases in Mexico where companies have come to a standstill for a week, week and a half, because a lot of their truckers were kidnapped and basically either released on payment or they were murdered. And this trickles upwards into the local management in country, because at the end of the day, it will be tied into extortion. So they'll kidnap a couple of people, they'll murder one or two, and then they'll start engaging senior management saying, you see the reach we have, we know who your wife is, we know who you are, we know where your kids go to school. And that's when the problems really start. And they will tend to not report it higher. They will try and mitigate it at their level, which at the end of the day can cause lots of problems with line of business for the corporation. Like I said, the highest incidences of under this current administration, Peña Nieto's, for kidnapping are the state of Mexico, Tamaulipas, Guerrero. And I'll add in here that we've been noticing a lot of tendencies right now in Acapulco, believe it or not. We have the federal police and the federal agencies fighting hand-to-hand against the cartels in Acapulco. However, one of the secondary effects of that is the kidnapping of some police forces, their agents and so forth. At this point, it's basically police entities that are being kidnapped. However, we're already starting to see maybe one or two cases where people associated with the police, who may be suppliers or who may be supporters of the police force also being kidnapped. We always have to keep in mind that kidnapping and extortion in Mexico, anyone is a target. We have seen in the past visitors to Mexico City, specifically about 2.5 years ago. The wives of 3 expats were visiting. Their driver made a wrong turn to try and cut through traffic, went into a very dubious neighborhood, and all 3 women were basically kidnapped. They were sexually assaulted, they were molested, they were detained for several days until payment was made, and then they were released. Needless to say, all 3 expats and wives returned to the U.S., creating a big void and gap, obviously, in that company in Mexico. So nobody is exempt from being kidnapped or being extorted. However, our current tendencies show that it's mostly the locals, the Mexican locals, who are exposed, and then number 2, it's chance kidnappings and extortion if you happen to, for example, take a wrong turn or be in the wrong place. As I mentioned earlier, the middle class is the preferred target, also the lower class, and they get targeted now for what's called express kidnappings. Basically, it's easier for them to be targeted because the kidnapper will ask for lower ransom amounts, $1,000 versus $3 million. So they can easily continue to operate and not get greedy, for lack of another word, kidnapping 10 people a month at $1,000 to $2,000 a head, and they'll do just fine. So they've decided to go and target the middle and lower class and secure payment versus going after a high value target at $3 million and start playing the negotiation game with one of the negotiators. Poor handling of the situation by any victim. In other words, you're getting carjacked, if you're assaulted on the street, you're extorted, or you've been kidnapped through virtual or express, it can develop into a long-term kidnapping. And that'll be done just out of spite. So best thing to do, if you've been assaulted, just do the best you can to walk away. If you're being carjacked, always just give your car over. If you're being extorted, you will, if you're a U.S. citizen, you will have to report this up. Express and virtual kidnapping, you have to play along, because if you don't, it could develop into a long-term kidnapping and it'll set off a continuous set of events that you will continuously be targeted, probably once every 2 years or even more, for some sort of a virtual kidnapping or express kidnapping. There is a significant increase in extortion currently in Mexico, which is tied hand in hand with kidnappings. The extortions themselves, once again, it's to make money while using threat and force against, once again, your local workers in Mexico. Narco kidnapping is plaguing the border area, and there is some transnational effects. We notice MS-13, Barrio 17, or Calle 17 in El Salvador being the worker bees for the cartels in Mexico. We do also see controlling the lines of communication and also the lines of distribution from Central America into Mexico into the U.S. So it does create some transnational dimensions in the region, and kidnapping is one of those tools. We just noticed recently how it is suspected that the cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación kidnapped both of El Chapo's sons recently in Mexico. Obviously, they're immediately released within 72 hours. However, the message was clear that this cartel, Jalisco Nueva Generación, is on the move. So that does happen a lot within the narco community, but it also does affect others not involved in the narco communities. Currently, the cartels like to use bandas criminales, or criminal bands or organizations, And while they are decentralized to a certain extent, they are allowed in that decentralized world to do kidnappings, to set up illegal checkpoints at night, to steal cars or steal people's items and so forth. However, they do report to the cartels in a loose fashion, but it does affect the populace, for example, transiting roads and so forth. As I mentioned here in the last one, they are well equipped, they're advised, and they do have that temporary membership, or they serve as an outsourcing element for the cartels. And we see this a lot in the regions of Sinaloa, Jalisco, moving through Michoacan, for example. Also, we see it on the east coast of the Gulf, operating in Tamaulipas, Veracruz region. So people are going to kidnap you. They divide themselves into different cells. The information cell is going to be responsible basically for gathering all the information on you, the target. So there'll be people that are going to be informants. This could be the lady that cleans your house, the lady that looks after your kids, the gardener. This could be your security guard that was recommended to you by a friend somewhere. So this is the cell that's going to collect all this information, and it's going to pass it off to the leader. The leader basically of this kidnapping ring will go ahead and start activating the operational cell. Basically, the operational cell will take all this information and start to develop a plan on how best to target you as a potential kidnappee. In other words, are they going to use a virtual express, or is it going to be a long-term kidnapping? So they will go ahead and assess that. They will put the plans together, or variants of various plans, in order to see which one best suits you. And basically, they will rehearse the kidnapping several times over. Once you've been kidnapped, basically you're going to go in a holding area. And these are the folks that will be responsible for your medication, for ensuring you don't escape, for ensuring to keep you awake, ensuring to keep you disoriented, and they will also go ahead and do everything in their means to make your stay as uncomfortable as possible. There will also be a negotiating cell. These people are not your kidnappers. They're too removed from the operational cell. However, they're the ones that know the negotiation techniques. For example, if they go in with a middle-class person who's been kidnapped, they basically know to start off maybe at 5,000 or 6,000. They know it may end up at 2,500 or 2,000. So these people know basically the schemes. They know how to negotiate, and they will be basically the ones that will be talking with the negotiator on the kidnappees or the kidnap side of the house. You have a money laundering cell. Once this money has been paid and they've recovered the funds, they're the ones that are going to go ahead and take those funds, and they're going to launder it some way. It could be into another business. It could be putting them in caches underground, or caletas like it's called, and just hide the money that way for another day. They are very well organized, and they do know what they're doing. And there's another part to this component, which is called the hostile planning cycle, which is a very deliberate planning cycle that does entail them doing a lot of reconnaissance on you, be it electronic, be it physical. They will conduct this. So when we start going into the crisis management portion for the kidnap and ransom, there has to be a crisis action committee, and it has to have been identified prior to. If you're waiting to develop your crisis action committee, the moment that you receive a call that a kidnapping is taking place, you're going to be about 10 to 20 steps behind the power curve. Your crisis action committee needs to be identified prior to, and every time there's a change in the company, it needs to be updated. This committee is not just put on the shelf for break glass in case of emergency. It has to be updated, and they continuously have to rehearse and go through tabletop exercises. What's going to be the negotiation strategy? Is it going to be a runaround? Is it going to be straightforward? Are you willing to end this quickly, or is the company wanting to drag out a bit to see how much money they can save? So these are some of the themes that will define what your negotiation strategy is going to be. Communication. Who's going to be the communicator? What is the communications plan? Is it going to be by cell phone? Are you going to be delivered a sat phone by the kidnappers, and that's going to be your way to communicate with them? Or are there going to be communication windows where you have to communicate with them, for example? It's not going to be a daily event. Timing. Okay, what is the timing of this? Did they kidnap this person knowing that they was about to sign a joint venture with XYZ company? Or did they do it in a timing that they know he was going to be named or she was going to be named to be the CFO of a company, for example, in XYZ country? So timing does play into this. Money. Okay, what is the range? What's the highest and what's the lowest acceptable? And this is something that will have to be obviously negotiated within the Crisis Action Committee along with the corporation's headquarters to define. What are the terms of the ransom payment? And where will this take place? How will it take place? And then there's also a procedure on when the victim returns. It's not he just walks back in and it's back to the desk. There's a whole process to reincorporate this victim back into society as soon as he is released from his captors. So when we do talk about it, we have to look at who's going to be the financial entity responsible for this. Is it going to be the family who's going to put up all the money? Is it going to be the corporation? Also, who are going to be your advisors through this process? Who's going to define the crisis management? Who's going to do the negotiation, the strategies? Who's going to get legal involved? Who's going to get the financial folks involved? What is the procedure that these advisors are going to present as the best way to tackle this situation? The negotiator. Who have you identified as a negotiator? Is it a family member? Is it a friend? Is it an attorney, the company attorney, family attorney? Is it their priest? But you have to keep in mind that some special skills and a specific profile are required for that negotiator. Sometimes it's important, depending on the region, the language, not necessarily the language, but the dialect or the words within that region that are utilized. So you might want to have somebody who's from the region. And depending on your initial contacts with the kidnappers, you may best define what type of negotiator you want speaking with the kidnappers. Representatives from the law. There's always going to be competition by the legal agencies for a crime, and what is the geography? In other words, what's defining which legal entity will participate in this process? Sometimes you want to seek the highest level. If you're in Mexico, the CONAS, the PFP, the PGR, the local PGJ, special groups, et cetera, et cetera. But you always have to keep in mind there's an alternative or there's an alternate reason to some of these agencies, and it's a lot of turf battle. Direct family members. Who is it that you want to have involved in this situation from a support standpoint? The parents, the siblings, the spouse, the son, the daughter. Sometimes spouses and parents can maybe become a bit emotionally attached to this situation. So sometimes there's a sibling there that is willing to step in and be the voice of the direct family members in this situation. So that's basically the circle for the steps basically governing the kidnap and ransom portion. And we mentioned these a minute ago. Sometimes the corporations, and I'll caveat by saying they like to play a bigger role. Sometimes, well, not sometimes, but mostly because the money's coming out of their pocket if a major ransom has to be paid. So you have to know how to manage that, and you have to know how to work with them. But at the same time, you have to take all these other factors into consideration. The victim's return. Okay, one of the things you always want to request basically is proof of life from the beginning to the end on both parts. One is you want to always ask for proof of life on the person, the victim, to know that they're okay. This can be preferably a picture with proof of date, but at the same time, as the negotiations move forward, you want to show that either money is being collected, or you want to show that there is a movement in a positive direction to bring a solution to this situation. So in the victim return, some of the things that you need to have already in place as this victim is returned is you need to have a doctor and support alternatives. If it's a long-term kidnapping, they may be malnourished. They may have started to generate some medical conditions that they did not have before. So a doctor would be critical. Comfortable clothes, or if it's been long-term, they're going to be they're going to want something comfortable to be in. They're going to want to bathe. They want to be in a comfortable environment. Food is going to be critical. If they have been held for a while, you can't greet them with the barbecued ribs and corn on the cob. Unfortunately, their stomach will not be prepared for that. So you have to work them into a dietary program. They're going to need some serious psychological attention. Even if it's a short express kidnapping or a virtual, it can cause a serious psychological strain on any individual. Who are the bystanders that you want around? Do you just want the immediate close family, or do you want to extend the circle out to friends and so forth? That's a call that the family will probably make along with the advisors as the process goes on. But you don't want to overwhelm a person with a welcome parade at the moment he is released. Some of the other things is, you generate a timeline for when the victim wants to speak, let's say with the police, when he wants to speak to the advisors. The company will also want to talk to him. When's the intimate moment where it's just him, the wife and the kids, for example, in a room, talking things through, or doing a lot of crying, or whatever it is that's going to take place. It's that intimate moment with the real close circle family. The moral support that needs to be generated. You got to remember, when you've been kidnapped, you feel that you've been stripped of everything. So you need that moral support to continue to build them up and make them understand basically this is not necessarily, it is not your fault, number one. And number two, reintegrate them back into society. And also at the end, there's going to be interview and analysis and recommendations. Basically, the advisors, the negotiator, the communicator, the police forces or security forces will all sit down, and each one will do their independent analysis and recommendations moving forward. In this case, depending on the nation that you're in or the country you're in, you would probably want to look at your advisors, your negotiator, and your communicator after action review and analysis, in addition to what your corporation's after action review and analysis is. And from there, you can get a pretty good idea of what we should do moving forward to prevent and preempt potentially another kidnapping of another employee in another part of the world or back in the same country. In conclusion, globalization is great, but it is introducing multinationals and transnational into crisis-laden regions. If we look at Libya, we see a lot of oil companies operating there, mostly British and French. If we look at, for example, parts of Africa, you have a lot of mines, for example, in the DRC and Congo. So that is a crisis-laden region, for example. If you look at some mine sites in Mozambique in the Tete region, we see a resurgence of Renimo, so fighting the government again. So, the days of business, or the true meaning of, or the natural resources, or the true generator of a business, you see it not that much in Paris. You do see it in Paris. You do see it in Canary Wharf in London. You do see it in Wall Street. But the generators of all this, the underlying is now mostly in parts of the world where there is crisis. And you have to be prepared for that crisis because the potential for that crisis could lead to kidnappings. Kidnapping cannot be beat. It survived centuries, millennia, and it's going to continue. However, we can mitigate it. And we can generate and create techniques and procedures that will generate or make somebody have a less of a profile, which will facilitate them potentially preempting any kidnapping against them. As you mentioned earlier, kidnapping is intertwined with gray zone of extortion schemes. Because if you do not comply to the extortion scheme, you will be kidnapped, a family member will be kidnapped, and from there you could either be recovered or you will become a statistic for death or murder. Kidnappings will continue to evolve as technology continues to improve. And nation states, they need to close that gap. They need to make it harder for technology to be utilized for kidnapping purposes or extortion purposes. We've seen how ISIS has used their own platform, Harama, to go ahead and kidnap people virtually and basically ask them to go to Turkey and some other countries in the region where they're kidnapped and not brought into the ISIS organization as such as fighters. Intelligence is key, and it needs to be run by multinationals, and that is going to be the key to the success. It has to be intelligence at the lowest level, which will facilitate not only your local employees averting kidnapping or extortion schemes, but also it will allow the headquarters and higher to understand the dynamics in which the employees are operating in X, Y, or Z country. And always remember that because you pay ransom, it does not guarantee your freedom. In some instances, we've seen where major ransoms have been paid and the person kidnapped has been murdered out of fear of being tracked or so forth. So it does not guarantee freedom. And that's something that you always have to keep at the back of your mind. Finally, I love to use this slide because it shows the two dynamics of current day kidnappings or hostage taking. If, as you're facing the screen, you look at the three gentlemen on the left, they were kidnapped by Al-Qaeda Maghreb. And basically, these individuals are businessmen, and that's the face that we see on the news every day. We do see every day in the news some Westerner being kidnapped by these factions. However, when we look at the side on the right, we're talking about a U.S. CEO who was held hostage by his own employees in China because he failed to understand the Social Security dynamics for payment in China, and his employees in China had not been paid or had not had monies paid into their Social Security, their version of Social Security, in a year. So when he landed to visit his employees, he was held hostage. So we have both dynamics here, one that is a violent method and one which is basically you need to understand your operational environment, even as a business, because you have to be aware of everything that is going on that could affect your safety when going overseas. This basically concludes my brief. This is my point of contact information, and I'll be available to take now any questions that you may have. I have a question here to talk from Sean Spence talking about self-kidnappings in Mexico. Self-kidnappings is once again something that's not new it's not something that's come up new. in recent years. But it is a trend that we do see. Sometimes self-kidnappings are basically you work for XYZ company and you feel that you have some sort of problem with them. So what you do is basically you'll have a friend, a loved one, somebody, and you'll set up a scheme. It's basically an extortion scheme whereby you will attempt to make your employer believe that you've been kidnapped. They have to provide ransom, and at the end of the day, that money is basically going into your pocket and your associates' pockets who helped you with this, and move on. Now, some of the indicators that you can see about this is if you have a troubled and once again, this depends on the specific countries. But in the case of Mexico, if you continuously see you have an employee that's troublesome, fails to adhere to policy, fails to meet the standards of the job for which he was employed, at times does become a distractor to the business. That's one of the people, for example, that you could potentially expect something to happen. Now in Mexico, labor law makes it very, very difficult to fire anybody. Even if you have counseling statements, even though you've gone through human resources, even though you've expended all those tools, they can go towards a court and actually make it very difficult for you to fire them. So if anybody does take that extra step and start threatening labor courts and you can potentially start preparing yourself for a potential self-kidnapping. Another thing that we notice is for self-kidnappings is people start living outside their means. Not that they pay much in Mexico, but if you start seeing people that you know, and once again, you have to make your lower echelon supervisors aware of this. If you start seeing some of their employees coming in, they make 5,000 pesos a month, but they start coming in a Harley Davidson motorcycle or things that do not go with their level of pay, you might want to raise your eyebrow and wonder what's going on, because this type of event could come and affect your company. And basically, it's called self-kidnapping, but it is considered a form of extortion. Do I have any other questions? Okay, well, I wish to thank everybody for their time this afternoon. Hopefully my presentation has been insightful, and please feel free to contact me if you do have any questions pertaining to Mexico or Latin America, and I can be of any service. I hope you have a great week, and look forward to hearing from you all in the future again. Thank you.